The ops floor at night was a controlled climate, cold air recycled until it tasted faintly metallic, constant fan noise layered in uneven harmonics, fluorescent light that never quite admitted it was tired. The building stayed awake even when the people tried to go home. I worked late because fewer voices meant fewer stories, and fewer stories meant fewer risks. I was running a routine latency pull when a single line in the audit stream snagged my attention. Not a spike, not a flood, just a line that refused to sit where it belonged. A timestamp tied to a reconciliation cycle that had already closed. A record marked as purged yet present. Not loud, just a quiet contradiction. Systems didn't glitch like that randomly. They failed loudly, or they failed in patterns we documented, charted, and learned to ignore. Quiet contradictions meant hands, not ghosts. I clicked into the record and waited for the interface to finish pretending it was thinking. Source, internal, classification, restricted. It carried a stub identifier that should have expanded into a full chain of custody and a retention policy. Instead, the interface stalled, the cursor blinking once, twice. Resolution unavailable. The words sat there, flat and polite. Soft errors were how bureaucracy sounded when it wanted you to stop asking questions without having to say stop. My finger hovered above the trackpad, the reflex before a decision that would be logged whether I liked it or not. I asked anyway. I opened the permissions pane. My badge token authenticated. The system gave me a clean, professional checkmark. For half a second, everything looked normal. Then the screen refreshed on its own. The checkmark vanished. Access restricted. Denied was a door. Restricted was a hallway that pretended it had never existed. I sat still, listening to the fans shift pitch as load redistributed somewhere above me. I tried again. Same result. I checked my own account activity log, expecting to see a note about a permission change. The system recorded my first click. It recorded my second click. It did not record the change that had happened between them. The absence sat on the screen like a deliberate smudge. No footsteps behind me. No shadow crossing the glass wall. No one needed to walk up and say anything. The wall had already moved. Procedure said, create an access request, route it through compliance, wait. Instinct said an access request would be a flare. Someone wanted to see if I would behave like a ticketing system. I switched views. Raw feed. No polished UI. No reassuring icons. Just the audit stream as the system wrote it, line by line, each entry indifferent to whether it ruined a day or not. The record was still there, thin as a hairline crack. I selected it and hit export. A confirmation window surfaced, asking me to affirm I had authorization to handle restricted data. It always did. The checkbox was a ritual, a small box that turned responsibility into something that felt like consent. I checked it. The progress bar crawled, advanced a few pixels, then froze. A message slid into place as if it had been waiting behind the interface the whole time. Export incomplete. Partial data retained. No reference number. No helpful link. No escalation path. The file saved anyway, a small encrypted package on my local drive stamped with a hash that didn't match any full record I'd ever handled. I opened it. Most of the contents were redaction blocks and null fields, the kind of emptiness you got when someone scrubbed a document until it could pass for nothing. Black bars where meaning should have been. One line survived in plain text. Not because anyone wanted it to, but because it lived a layer above whatever was being buried. Name, Julian Rowe. My jaw tightened. The sensation wasn't cinematic. It was mechanical, like a tendon pulling against a knot that had been set years ago and never loosened. Julian's name was a compartment I kept sealed, because the last time I tried to do the right thing around him, the system taught me what it considered right. I forced myself to keep reading, treat it as data, not memory. The partial export held a timestamp range and a project tag scrubbed down to a single character. It wasn't enough to reconstruct a narrative. It was enough to prove this wasn't an accident. I went back to the permissions pane, not expecting access, but wanting to see what the system would admit to. Access restricted. Beneath it, a new line pulsed briefly, then settled. Policy update applied. Policy updates didn't apply to one record. They applied to categories. They applied to people. I pulled up my access roster, a familiar grid of resources I could touch and the ones I couldn't. One item disappeared, then another. Not fast, not dramatic, just the quiet shrinking of a perimeter. I opened the metadata on the partial export. Creation time matched the second I hit export. Encryption tag was correct. Hash was new. Then I saw the access trace inside the package. A read request hit the file 2 seconds after it landed on my drive. It wasn't a process I recognized on my machine. It wasn't a normal integrity scan. It matched the company's own validation pattern, the one used before something was archived under compliance. Except I hadn't sent it anywhere. My mouth went dry. I listened to the room, fans, vents, the distant bell of an elevator cycling through empty floors. No footsteps. The watcher didn't need a body. The watcher had a pipeline. I copied the partial file to a second location on my drive and renamed it with a string that meant nothing. I didn't upload it. I didn't share it. I didn't do anything that could be labeled a leak. I just kept it. That, I understood, was enough. My access was already contracting. It wasn't violence. It was procedure. It was the slow, professional erasure of a person's ability to see. I looked back at the one clean line that refused to become a blank field. Julian Rowe. If I stopped now, his death would stay a clean absence in the logs, the kind the company could live with. The kind I had lived with until the system placed his name back in my hands. I locked my screen and sat there for another minute, breathing carefully, letting the air taste like recycled metal and dust. It wasn't fear of being harmed that tightened my stomach. It was fear of being rewritten. I had a partial copy of something that shouldn't exist, and someone had already looked at it. Who was watching my metadata? The garage was colder than the ops floor, a slab of concrete that held the night. The air smelled of dust and old oil, and every sound traveled farther than it should have. Footsteps echoed down the lanes and came back altered, doubled. Overhead, sodium lights hummed with a tired electrical buzz. I parked on a level that stayed half empty after midnight and sat with both hands on the steering wheel, leather cool against my palms, watching the entrance ramp in the mirror. A car passed somewhere above, tires whispering across concrete, then silence settled again. The partial export sat on my drive like a warm spot on metal. I could feel it without touching it. I'd left the building with my access shrinking behind me. I couldn't tell whether the system wanted me scared or compliant. Maybe it didn't care which, as long as I adjusted. A message came in on a number I didn't have saved. Down one. No greeting. No punctuation. I didn't answer. I rolled lower instead, letting the tires murmur over the arrows as the ramp curved. On the next level, a black sedan idled in the far corner, lights off, engine ticking at rest. Nora Pike stepped out and crossed the distance without hurrying. Plain coat, plain shoes, a face built for deniability. She opened my passenger door, let the dome light come on, then got in and shut it behind her. The click of the latch sounded louder than it should have. She didn't look at me first. She looked up, toward the camera above the lane, holding her gaze there long enough to remind me this place was recorded even when it felt empty. "I'm not here to be your friend," she said. Short sentence. No softness. "I'm here because you touched something you weren't supposed to touch." "I didn't file anything," I said, keeping my eyes forward. "You didn't have to." She set a phone face down on the console between us. A burner by look, nothing special. She didn't offer it. The point was the boundary. The system saw you. It's adjusting. A car alarm chirped somewhere lower, then died. "Adjusting how?" I said. "Access. Calendar. HR language. The polite ways." Her voice stayed flat, like she was reading a checklist she'd memorized. "You're going to lose scope. People will stop replying. Meetings will appear that you didn't schedule. If you act surprised, you'll make it easier." The company didn't send threats. It sent friction. I said, "Julian Rowe?" Nora's eyes moved to me for the first time, quick and narrow. "You got the name." "I got an incomplete copy," I said. "And it got touched 2 seconds after it landed." Her hand went still on her knee. "That fast?" "So, I'm not imagining the Watcher." "No," she said. "You're just late." "What is it?" I asked. "What am I looking at?" She didn't answer right away. She watched the dark lane beyond the windshield, as if the garage itself might be listening. "It's protected," she said. "By access control." She shook her head once. "By structure?" I waited, listening to the lights hum. "A legal shell," she said. A firewall was still a wall. This felt like paper stacked thick enough that responsibility slid off before it could stick. "It means the record you touch doesn't belong to the entity you think it does," she went on, tone unchanged. "It means liability gets routed somewhere empty. People can deny involvement and still be telling the truth. It's paperwork designed to absorb damage." The anomaly wasn't a bug. It was a boundary. "My copy is incomplete," I said. "That's why you're still breathing normally," she said, as if calm were a condition that could be revoked. "An incomplete copy is a fragment. A fragment is manageable. A full record is a problem." My jaw tightened with the same mechanical pull I'd felt when I saw Julian's name. "What happened to him?" Her gaze stayed on the windshield. "He's not here." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting from me tonight." No shift in her voice. "Dead. Missing. Reassigned to a word that sounds clean. Pick one. The result is the same." The garage lights hummed. The world continued, indifferent and well lit. Nora leaned back slightly, still angled toward the door. "Don't dig," she said. "Not like this. If you create the wrong request in the wrong channel, you leave a trail they can use. If you try to force access, you turn yourself into a story the system can close." "Everything leaves a trail," I said. "Exactly." One nod. "Even your silence." She opened the door. Cold air pushed in, sharp and dry. Before she stepped out, she added, "You're on a timeline. Not a bomb. A process. The kind that ends with a meeting and language that sounds like compassion." "Quiet exit," I said. She didn't confirm or deny it. She just looked at me like I'd finally named the right thing, then crossed the concrete back to her car. The dome light clicked off when I shut my door. My phone vibrated once. Not a message. A system notification. Access update. I opened my work profile. Another permission group had disappeared. A stream I relied on for my day-to-day work was gone. No warning. No explanation. Just absence, clean and professional. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. The wall I'd hit upstairs hadn't been technical at all. It had been legal. Designed, layered, and already in motion. Julian was dead or missing, and my life was being edited around the fact that I knew his name again. I sat in the cold car, listening to the echo of my own breathing bounce off concrete, and tried to picture the shape of the shell Nora had named. What was the legal shell hiding? The HR notice arrived the way bad weather did now, not as a storm, but as a push notification pretending to be routine. My phone gave a thin, irritating ping on the desk, loud in the quiet of the room. It hit my inbox at 7:12, timestamped like a fact, phrased like a favor. Performance alignment. Next steps. No greeting, no accusation. Just a calendar link and a sentence about supporting sustainable output. I read it twice, then a third time. I looked for anything human. It wasn't there. The language was identical to benefits enrollment and mandatory training. If I reacted like it was a threat, I would be the one breaking tone. I clicked the invite. The mouse made a soft plastic click in the silence. It was a 30-minute block titled Alignment Session. Organizer. HR Operations. Attendees. Me. A blank field. And a room number that didn't exist on any floor plan I could access anymore. Since the garage, my calendar permissions had narrowed. Whole teams vanished from my visibility. The invite still appeared. If they wanted to reach me, they didn't need my cooperation. I logged into my work environment and opened the audit stream that had started this. The UI still said access restricted. The raw feed still carried the thin contradiction, a purged item that existed. Julian's name had been the only clean line inside my incomplete copy. Not enough to build a case. Enough to cast a shadow. I pulled the partial file and ran its hash again. Same result. The file hadn't been altered locally. That didn't mean it hadn't been read. It meant whoever was watching preferred me to believe I still owned it. I followed the breadcrumb the way I would have before it got personal. Slowly, methodically, one edge at a time. I didn't try to break in. I examined the seams where the system had already failed to close itself. The partial export included a time range. It overlapped a scheduled maintenance window 3 months back. Maintenance windows created legitimate noise. They were also where deliberate changes hid best, because no one wanted to parse logs during a patch cycle. I searched that window in my own account activity. The system let me. I found my badge token recorded there, a routine sign-in. I found a second token using my workstation ID at 2:19, a time when I had been asleep. The entry didn't say unauthorized. It said delegated. A delegated token was how the company described doing something to you for your own good. Consent by policy, not by person. Under the delegated entry, a note field existed where notes were rarely used. One line sat there, unformatted, like someone had typed it into the log because there was no safer place. If you're reading this, they let you. My hand went still on the mouse. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and measured, louder than the HVAC. The line wasn't a system artifact. It was a person's fingerprint. I copied it into a local text file and saved it under a name that meant nothing. The mouse wheel clicked once as I scrolled, then I stopped. My private rule surfaced the way it always did when things started to smell like a life. I don't make it personal. Procedure problems could be solved with procedure. Personal problems made you visible. Julian was personal, and he had left a message inside a structure designed to deny he'd ever existed. I scrolled again. The delegated token had touched a storage path linked to the same scrubbed project tag in my export. It pulled a single file descriptor, not the file itself. Enough to prove existence, not enough to reproduce it. The descriptor included a checksum field, blank. Under it, another note line waited. Don't ask for the original. Hold what you can. That wasn't melodrama. It was survival advice. I leaned back in my chair and realized my eyes burned. My neck felt locked. My mouth was dry. The room was silent enough that the faint whine of my laptop fan sounded accusatory. I could close the file. I could walk into the HR alignment session and accept whatever reclassification they offered. Quiet exit didn't have to be a war. It could be an agreement, a controlled loss. People did it every day and kept their names intact. But Julian's note changed the meaning of stopping. Stopping wouldn't be safety. It would be erasure by cooperation. I opened the incomplete copy again and embedded both note lines into a separate bundle in my private archive. Still no upload. Still no leak. Just custody. 30 minutes until alignment. My calendar reminded me, vibrating once on the desk. Then, a new invitation arrived, not from HR, from an executive assistant addressed with a clean, confident signature block. Meeting request. Martin Kessler. The slot was immediate. The location was the top floor. I stared at the invite and felt the clean shift from soft pressure to direct management. HR had been the edge. This was the center. I accepted before I could talk myself out of it. The moment I clicked yes, my calendar refreshed. The HR alignment session vanished, as if it had never existed. The company was offering me a different kind of alignment. If Martin Kessler wanted to talk, it wasn't to ask what I knew. It was to tell me what I was allowed to keep. At me disk, the ops floor sounded the way it always did. HVAC breath, distant server hum, keyboards that never quite stopped. I logged in and watched permissions load like doors unlocking in sequence. 2 of them didn't unlock. The system didn't announce what it took. It just rearranged my world and waited for me to pretend it was normal. I reopened the HR invite. The room number looked specific but wrong, like a form field filled with a lie. No profile card for the organizer. No human contact. A machine inviting me to a meeting about my humanity. I saved the note lines one more time, not because I needed to, but because redundancy was the only form of care the system still allowed. The elevator ride up felt like crossing into a different climate zone. Downstairs, the ops floor stayed honest. Fluorescent light, constant fan noise, cold air that tasted faintly metallic because it had been recycled too many times. Up here, the carpet drank footsteps, and the air smelled like nothing on purpose. Martin Kessler's office was glass in height. The lighting was warm, but it wasn't comfort. It was control. He stood to greet me, polite in the way people were polite when they didn't need anything from you. His handshake was dry and brief. His smile arrived and left on schedule. "Elias," he said, "thank you for making time." I sat where he pointed. The chair was too soft, the kind that asked your body to relax before your mind could object. A tablet rested on the table between us, along with a single page of paper. No red stamps. No confidential theater. Just clean materials in a clean room. He didn't ask what I'd found. He didn't ask why I'd been in the audit stream after hours. He started with the language of care. He said he wanted to support alignment. He said he'd noticed unusual engagement lately. He said the company took sustainable output seriously. The phrases were smooth, and the cadence matched HR, concern as a template. I listened the way I listened to logs, not for meaning, but for function. Every clause kept responsibility unnamed. When he finally referenced the anomaly, he didn't call it an anomaly. He called it an artifact and a legacy record surfaced outside its intended life cycle. He made it sound like housekeeping. He asked, gently, whether I'd had any trouble with access. I saw a record marked purged. I said. It was still present. Martin nodded like I'd reported a flickering bulb. Sometimes systems behave in ways that don't match the model people carry, he said. It can feel personal. It rarely is. He tapped the tablet. A slide appeared with a simple header. Risk Appetit. Bullet points underneath, the kind you could defend in a board meeting. He spoke over it in longer sentences, drifting into passive voice, using euphemisms like value preservation and stakeholder confidence. Then he gave me the logic. Not shouted, not theatrical, just presented. Truth, he said, could cascade into secondary harm. It could destabilize teams, trigger litigation, invite regulators, spook partners, ghost jobs. He said stability wasn't an excuse. It was an obligation. His argument wasn't absurd. That was the problem. I'm going to be direct, he said. We've noticed your activity. There it was. The admission, delivered like a favor. He didn't list every click, but he didn't need to. He referenced time windows. He referenced patterns. He referenced workflow deviations. He made it sound like a dashboard. You're very good at your job, he said. That's not in question. Then he slid the paper across the table. Risk, label, review. The words were printed in a neutral font. Underneath were categories and mitigation steps. Information handling, governance misalignment, access hygiene. It wasn't discipline. It was filing. You're not in trouble, Martin said. We're adjusting scope so you can stay productive. The sentence landed the way access restricted had landed on my screen. Polite. Final. You changed permissions on a live record, I said. I don't manage permissions, he replied. Teams do. Systems do. Policies do. A small smile. Legal hold exists for a reason. Sometimes it's applied broadly. Sometimes it's applied narrowly. Context matters. He used legal hold like an umbrella. My incomplete copy stayed in my pocket, not as a device, but as a weight. Pressure turned data into sensation. Martin leaned forward a fraction. I want you to hear me, he said. This isn't about punishing curiosity. It's about preventing harm. He spoke in that calm, exhaustive corporate way. If there's an artifact, we contain it. We learn from it. We don't let it become a story that devours the organization. I'm not asking what you have, he said. I'm asking you to stop turning this into leverage. If you need support, we can provide it. If you need time, we can provide it. What we can't provide is open-ended investigation under misaligned intent. Misaligned intent. I kept my voice flat. You knew Julian Rowe. A tiny delay crossed his face. Latency in flesh. I knew of him, he said. He was talented. The pause was small. He made choices that complicated things. He stood, and the meeting ended without being announced. He walked me to the door himself. You'll see changes, he said. Access, workstream routing, calendar structure, treat it as a reset. Don't fight the system. It will only make it harder. On the way down, my phone buzzed with an innocuous policy ping about updated governance posture. When I sat back at my desk and logged in, 2 resources that always loaded didn't. The system didn't explain what it took. It just rearranged my world and waited for me to pretend it was normal. Martin hadn't been scared. He'd been managing me. My home office was a corner of my apartment where the light was always wrong. That week, it felt like a waiting room where silence wasn't calm. It was surveillance. The first thing I noticed wasn't a message. It was the absence of them. Emails that should have landed didn't. Chat stayed unread without ever turning into seen. When I typed a colleague's name into the directory, the profile card failed to load, then returned a generic error. Not delete, not blocked, just nothing. I logged in anyway. The login took longer than usual, a few extra seconds of latency that tightened my skin. MFA prompts arrived, polite little hurdles. Every time I cleared one, another appeared somewhere else. I pulled up the audit stream. Access restricted still sat there like a sign taped over a window. The raw feed still carried the thin contradiction, a purged item that existed. The incomplete copy stayed on my drive, renamed, duplicated, kept boring on purpose. I didn't open it immediately. I listened first. The refrigerator cycling, the hiss of air through the vent, the small clicks of my laptop fan ramping up and down. When I opened the package, it was the same as before. Redaction blocks, null fields, emptiness, shaped like intention. Julian Rowe's name was still there, the clean line that refused to become a blank field. I wasn't hunting new data anymore. I was testing the perimeter. So I created a signal. I took a harmless detail from the incomplete copy, too thin to matter on its own, and placed it where it didn't belong. Not published, not sent, just staged inside my own environment like bait. Then I waited, listening to the drive spin down, and then spin up again. The response came fast, but not fast enough to feel like coincidence. In the version history of a document I hadn't shared, a new view event appeared. A read that wasn't me. The timestamp was crisp. The user field was blank. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. The canary trap wasn't a metaphor. It was a mechanism. They weren't reacting to my choices. They were tagging my movements, measuring how I behaved under narrowing options. I tried to call a contact. The call rang once, then dropped into voicemail without ever connecting. When I tried a different channel, the message sent and stayed in delivered forever, never flipping to read, never bouncing back. Ali loss looked like normal absence. My calendar refreshed on its own. A meeting I hadn't created appeared for next week, labeled in soft language, wellness check-in. Then a different message arrived, not from HR, Not from Martin, but from a number I didn't have saved. There is a way out. The words sat on the screen like a hand resting on a door handle. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't comfort. It was an offer shaped like containment. A second line followed. Scope it. Keep your incomplete copy. Stop pushing for the original. I didn't need a signature to know who it was. Nora Pike didn't dopoetre. She did exits. I leaned back and let the chair creak. My neck ached from hunching over the screen. My mouth was dry because I'd forgotten to drink water. The details were annoying, trivial, human. The Canary trap reframed everything. The anomalies, the access changes, the polite friction. It wasn't chaos. It was a guided path. I opened the incomplete copy again and stared at Julian Rowe's name. A fragment was manageable. That was what Nora had said. That was what Martin believed. I closed the file without deleting it. I didn't upload it. I didn't leak it. I kept custody, and in the quiet of my apartment, with the hum of my laptop fan and the blank glow of the screen, I understood the new shape of the problem. I wasn't chasing the truth anymore. I was the thing being tracked. And the system was steering me toward a quiet exit, using nothing but absence, latency, and language that sounded like care. The cafe was neutral by design. Not quiet, not loud. Espresso hissing behind the counter, cups touching saucers, a low braid of conversations that never quite formed sentences. Enough noise to make recording useless and anger look ridiculous. I sat with my back to a wall, phone face down, laptop closed. The incomplete copy wasn't something I could place between us like a confession. It lived in a folder with a harmless name, and in my head, Nora Pike arrived exactly on time and alone. No briefcase, no visible security, no choreography. She carried a thin envelope and sat across from me as if this were routine. "You look worse," she said, flat. "I slept," I said. "We moved on." She set the envelope on the table and kept her palm on it. The paper didn't look important. That was the trick. What she offered was scope, a boundary, the shape the truth was allowed to take once it stopped being mine alone. They were preparing language, she said, the kind that made you feel like you'd chosen something. HR phrasing, legal phrasing, polite verbs that closed doors without sounding like locks. I wasn't being blocked anymore. I was being guided. I told her I knew. She nodded once. There was a narrative they would allow. It would admit a small fault to hide a larger intent, a process gap, a documentation irregularity, something technical enough to be forgettable and human enough to be believable. Controlled distortion. I hated how clean it felt. Nora kept it simple. The story stayed inside a boundary, or the legal shell closed and I got nothing. I asked what I got for agreeing. She listed survival the way some people listed benefits. I kept my name. I kept the ability to work. The daily friction on my access stopped tightening. The door appeared. Quiet exit, without the words. I asked what happened if I refused. She didn't hesitate. The shell tightened. Access narrowed. The incomplete copy became a liability I couldn't use, because anything I touched became traceable. The exit would still happen, just without courtesy. I pulled the envelope toward me and opened it. Inside was a term sheet without letterhead. Thin paper. No author line. No signature block. just sections written in bloodless terms. Scope of disclosure. Permitted. An internal review. Confirmation that a record was mishandled. A statement that remediation was complete. Prohibited. Names beyond former employee. Describing intent. Mentioning legal hold, privilege, or any structure that implied deliberate containment. It didn't tell me what happened. It told me what reality was allowed to look like. I read it twice. Reading it felt like agreeing. When Nora said, "Hand over what you have," my stomach tightened. The incomplete copy was a file, yes, but it was also leverage. If I surrendered everything, I surrendered the only proof that Julian had ever been more than a staffing line item. So I nodded as if hand over meant comply, and made the private correction in my head. Comply visibly, keep one fragment out of the turnover. Insurance. Not to win, to keep the trail from being erased cleanly. I said Julian's name once. Low. Nora's gaze dropped for a fraction of a second. Then it reset. I couldn't say his name publicly, she said, not in a way that made him real. The shell wouldn't allow it. I asked what she needed from me. No more escalating through internal channels. No more anomalous clicks. No more reaching for colleagues who had already been told to ghost me. And I had to hand over what I had. I told her what I had was incomplete. That was why we could do this, she said. Incomplete meant negotiable. The decision had been made before I walked in. A small technical choice disguised as a human one. I would comply on paper and withhold a fragment. Not enough to publish. Enough to keep Julian from becoming a blank field again. Nora asked what I wanted in return. Time, I said, and for the pressure on my access to stop tightening long enough for me to relocate my life into a place where my badge didn't matter. She slid a pen across the table. I initialed the sections. Not a signature. An acknowledgement. A record that I had been offered scope and had chosen it. A record. Always a record. Nora took the envelope back and stood. I'd get a follow-up soon. My phone vibrated against the table. Not a work alert. A number I didn't recognize, but the name on the screen was clear. Claire Benton. Nora saw it and exhaled once. I answered on the second vibration, keeping my voice low. Claire didn't introduce herself. She said my name, then said we needed to talk. Not on my company line. Not tomorrow. The cafe noise pressed in, louder now that the table was empty. The deal was done. The exit was being prepared, and the press had found my name before I could decide how to use it. I stared at the blank space where the term sheet had been. Either I was being guided toward silence, or toward a controlled kind of truth. Either way, the clock had started. Claire Benton's workspace looked like a place where facts went to get tired, the kind of tired that came from being handled too carefully for too long. Glass walls caught reflections instead of offering privacy. The blinds were half lowered, permanently undecided. Stacks of paper sat in loose piles that weren't dramatic so much as resigned to being there. Beyond the glass, the newsroom moved in bursts, then stalled, the low hum of voices rising and falling like a system waiting for permission to proceed. She met me without a handshake. Not rude. Careful. Her eyes flicked to my badge clip, then away, as if acknowledging it for too long would make it part of the story. I didn't sit until she sat. When I did, the chair creaked, the sound sharp in the controlled noise of the room, and I felt it land heavier than it should have. You shouldn't have come here, she said. Liability and warning compressed into one clean sentence. I'm already on a path, I said. I need to know if it leads anywhere. Claire didn't argue. She asked for the smallest piece that proved I wasn't wasting her time, the minimum input required to justify the risk of even listening. I gave her the incomplete copy the only way I could without turning it into a tutorial. A printed snapshot, a timestamp chain, a short explanation of what the anomaly implied. Enough to show intent, not enough to teach anyone how to replicate it. My fingers left faint warmth on the paper as I slid it across. She read in silence. The newsroom hum seeped through the glass. Her eyes moved faster over familiar corporate language, then slowed, almost imperceptibly, when the text implied a person instead of a process. When she saw Julian Rowe's name, she stopped. Her finger rested on the line. That name, she said. It's either a dead employee or a live lawsuit. Or both, I said. She lined the pages up on her desk, squaring the edges as if alignment could create clarity. Paper whispered against paper. Is it under legal hold? She asked. The phrase landed like a stamp you couldn't lift once it hit. I don't have a notice, I said, but I've been treated like I do. Claire nodded once, absorbing that. If it's under legal hold, she said, publishing anything derived from it becomes a battlefield. Not because the facts are weak, because the structure is strong. I watched her hands as she spoke. There was an ink smudge on one finger, half cleaned, half permanent. The hands of someone who fought with paper and deadlines instead of doors. Can you verify it? I asked. I can verify the what? She said. The existence of a record. The fact something was altered or mishandled. The fact the name belongs to a person. And the why? I said. Claire exhaled, slow and controlled. The why is where you get sued into silence. She turned her monitor toward me. A draft she'd been working on filled the screen. The meaningful parts were covered in black rectangles. Redaction blocks. Not metaphor. Practice. This is what happens, she said. You bring me something real. I confirm it's real. Then legal turns the real into non-actionable. She didn't say legal shell, but the shape of it was unmistakable. So we publish nothing, I said. We publish something, she corrected. But it won't be the explosion you imagine. She didn't soften the sentence. She grounded it. She asked for context that proved reaction, not methods. Access change notices, emails that bounced, calendar invites with neutral titles and sharp consequences. Anything that showed the system steering instead of merely denying. I understood the ask. Evidence of constraint. A trail. I can give you that, I said. A slice. Claire accepted the limitation without comment. She didn't ask for the original. She didn't ask for a miracle. She asked for what could survive contact with counsel. She began tightening the draft, removing anything that sounded like an accusation. Watching her work felt like watching someone build a cage out of correct punctuation. Keys clicked softly. The cursor hovered, deleted, replaced. When she read a paragraph aloud to test it, the words were careful and dry, shaped to pass through review without bleeding. The kind of story that would make most people shrug and a few people start asking uncomfortable questions. It was smaller than what I wanted. It was larger than silence. Claire didn't dramatize any of it. She treated risk like math. She explained, in plain terms, that verification created records. Every email could be forwarded to counsel. Every request for comment could trigger internal process. Corporations didn't fear reporters the way people imagined. They feared timelines they couldn't control, so they turned everything into a controlled timeline. I watched her cursor hover over a line that named a team, then delete it. A department. A sentence that implied intent became a discrepancy. A line that tied the anomaly to a decision became an irregularity under review. Language shrinking the world until it fit inside defensible nouns. When she mentioned privilege, she made it practical. If counsel touched it, parts became protected. If protected, untouchable. If untouchable, the public story became a shell around a hollow center. The company would offer helpful comment, then bury her in ongoing process. Nora had offered scope in the language of fixers. Claire was showing me scope in the language of publication. Different room, same ceiling. Claire wanted proof that the system reacted without me teaching anyone how I'd seen it. Screenshots of access changes, bland HR notifications that pretended to be support, calendar invites that looked harmless until they weren't, paperwork that made fear look like professionalism. She finished a version that could be published and looked up. It will be partial, she said. It will leave questions. That's what survives. I gathered the pages and felt how thin they were. Paper was fragile. Trails were fragile. Sometimes fragile was the only thing the system didn't bother crushing, because it didn't look like a threat until it was too late. In the hallway, my footsteps sounded too steady for how my stomach felt. The air smelled faintly of toner and burnt coffee, the residue of other people's deadlines. As I stood, my phone buzzed with a calendar update. Not a message, not a threat. A meeting request. Subject line, alignment. Location, executive office. Claire saw my face change and didn't ask what it was. She said, quietly, "That's them." I looked at the time. The meeting was set for the morning. The company wasn't going to stop me with violence. It was going to close my future with scheduling. I walked out with a story that would be blurred on purpose, and with the certainty that my exit was no longer hypothetical. It had a timestamp. The first sign wasn't a knock on my door or a security guard at my desk. It was a message posted like weather, something you were meant to notice and accept without asking who had written it. Corporate notice board. Update. The subject line didn't mention me. It didn't mention Julian. It mentioned organizational alignment, the phrase you use when you want a decision to sound like gravity instead of choice. I read it in the elevator. The memo was written in severance language. Cold, polite, final. It congratulated teams for delivering under uncertainty, thanked cross-functional partners, and announced that a project had reached a natural conclusion. No one wrote, "We are burying a mistake." They wrote, "We are closing a chapter." At the bottom was the sentence that mattered. All related materials have been consolidated under appropriate governance. Appropriate governance meant legal folders and access revocations. It meant a legal hold that didn't need to be announced to do its job. It meant the original evidence would become a rumor inside a structure designed to outlast rumors. When the elevator doors opened, my badge still worked. The system didn't slam doors. It let you walk into the room where the door would close behind you. The ops floor looked the same as ever. Monitors glowing, The low hum of machines, clusters of quiet conversation that didn't pause when I passed. The memo had been written to prevent panic. It offered everyone a script. Professional, grateful, resigned. My inbox refreshed. A calendar invite appeared with a title that could have belonged to any week. Transition meeting. Location: Conference Room 14B. Host: People Operations. Time: 3 p.m. No Martin Kessler in the sender line. No executive flourish. The absence was its own message. Martin didn't need to show his face to move the board. At 2:58, I walked to 14B. 2 People Ops reps waited with water and a folder already placed on the table. Their smiles were practiced, but not cruel. They used my name like an item on a checklist and thanked me for my contributions, each sentence shaped to sound supportive. Then they slid the folder across the table. Paper on laminate. A controlled sound. The first page summarized my transition package. The numbers were generous enough to feel like an insult. Severance pay, extended benefits, outplacement services, a line about supporting your next chapter. The second page was the real document. Confidentiality and non-disparagement. The clauses were written like a lullaby. Reasonable tone, reasonable verbs. In exchange for money and a clean exit, I would agree not to discuss internal matters, not to share proprietary information, not to make statements that could be interpreted as damaging. There was no sentence that said do not tell the truth. The contract didn't need that. It just needed to make the truth expensive. A section referenced materials subject to legal hold. The phrase sat there like it had always belonged in my life. I asked what happened if I didn't sign. They didn't threaten. They explained, without my signature, the package would be reduced to the minimum required by policy. My access would end immediately. My badge would be disabled. An escort could be arranged for convenience. Convenience. Another polite knife. I felt the justice ceiling come into view with brutal clarity. This was the system winning, not by disproving me, not by arguing facts, but by removing me from the room where facts mattered. One rep asked if I had questions. She said it like she meant it. I asked for time to review. They said of course. They encouraged it. Then they pointed to the date in the corner. Signature requested by end of day. The timeline was the pressure. The kindness was the wrapper. I left with the folder under my arm. Back at me desk, the quiet exit was already spreading. Access warnings. Auto forward rules revoked. A notice that my account would be deprovisioned pending completion of transition steps. Deprovisioned. The verb that turned a person into an asset being reclaimed. I checked the folder on my drive where the incomplete copy lived. It was still there. It opened. It was still incomplete. The meaning was still intact. For now. Across the floor, people adjusted to the new language with startling speed. Conversations moved on. Screens refreshed. The memo had done its job. The battlefield was being dissolved in real time. Martin didn't have to confront me again. He had dissolved the context in which confrontation mattered. I could feel the move without seeing the man. Martin's win wasn't a person in a doorway. It was policy appearing everywhere at once, like a software update nobody consented to. I opened a routine dashboard out of reflex and watched it hesitate, then load with fewer tabs than yesterday. A permission set trimmed while I was still seated. The chat list showed green dots that never turned into replies. The system didn't accuse me. It simply stopped acknowledging me. I packed my desk in slow motions, a notebook with dog-eared pages, a cheap pen that had survived too many meetings, a security token I no longer trusted. Each item felt lighter than the language in the folder. When I clipped my badge off, the plastic edge caught on my shirt and snapped free with a sound that made a few heads turn. No one asked why. On my way out, the reader at the glass door beeped once more. Neutral. Professional. As if it didn't know it was counting down. In the parking garage, the air was colder, more honest. Concrete held the day's chill like memory. I leaned against my car and looked at the folder again, not because I needed to, but because my body needed proof the fragment still existed. The quiet exit offered me a clean disappearance and a lifetime of paid silence. It also offered me something else, a clear view of the line. Take the money and vanish, or push once more and burn whatever bridge the system had left me. I stared at my phone screen, dark enough to reflect my face back at me, and tried to decide which kind of erasure I could live with. The folder sat on my passenger seat like a weight that refused to be described as paper. It shifted slightly when I closed the door, a soft sound that felt louder than it should have. I stayed in the garage because concrete held the cold, honestly. Fluorescent strips flattened everything, as if depth itself were a permission you had to request and hadn't been granted. The quiet exit package had been built to feel generous. Numbers big enough to look like mercy. Clauses soft enough to sound like professionalism. An agreement written so you could tell yourself you weren't being bought, only supported. I reread the confidentiality page, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to hear the tone beneath the language. The verbs were careful. The nouns were wide. Internal matters. Proprietary information. Statements that could be interpreted as damaging. It didn't outlaw truth. It outlawed the shape truth needed in order to live. There was a line about materials under legal hold. It didn't say my name. It didn't have to. The document assumed compliance the way gravity assumed falling. Nora had offered scope. Claire had offered a ceiling. Martin had offered an ending that looked clean on paper. All of them had the same purpose: to make the fragment I held feel too small to matter and too expensive to keep. My phone buzzed. Signature requested by end of day. A timer without a ticking sound. Signing meant the incomplete copy became a private guilt I'd been paid to store. It meant Julian Rose stayed a line the company could keep half erased. It meant I kept my name in the industry by agreeing to let the record remain ambiguous. Refusing meant the system did what it always did when you rejected its language. It deprovisioned you, closed accounts, revoked badge access, and turned you into former employee before you reached the elevator. That had been the cost vector since scene 1. Identity, not blood. I checked my work dashboard one last time. Fewer tiles than yesterday. A strip of permissions vanished while I watched. A notice appeared in the corner. Transition in progress. No anger in it. No threat. Just a status update. The way the system described weather. I didn't have the original. I didn't have a clean story. What I had was a fragment and a trail, and the knowledge that trails were the only thing this world respected, because trails could be audited. So the act I chose wasn't a broadcast. It wasn't a dramatic leak. It was an irreversible placement of the fragment in a lane the company couldn't scrub without leaving a bigger mark than it wanted. I texted Claire Benton from the personal number I'd used before. 2 words. Here. Then, garage level C. She arrived 10 minutes later, alone, coat collar up, moving like someone who knew cameras existed and refused to feed them. No press badge, no entourage, just a messenger bag and that controlled newsroom tiredness. "We didn't trade speeches?" she asked, quietly, if I was sure. I didn't answer in morals. I answered in objects. I handed her a plain envelope. Inside were printed snapshots from the incomplete copy, the access shrink notices, the HR phrasing, and a simple timeline that showed the blur wasn't accidental. Not the whole truth. Enough to prove the shape of it. "You can publish the redacted version," I said. "But keep this so the redaction can't pretend it was clarity." She held it like it might burn. "This doesn't change the macro," she said. "I know," I said. "It changes the record." Claire glanced at the folder on my seat. "If you sign, you're safe," she said. Safe enough. The word safe tasted like a policy update. I pulled the folder out, flipped to the signature page, and stared at the line. The pen clip was still attached, as if the company had been kind enough to provide my tools for surrender. For a moment I felt the comfort it promised. Continuity, a clean break, a story where I stayed employable. Then I set the pen down. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, just a small refusal that felt heavy in the quiet garage. "I'm not signing," I said. Claire didn't nod like approval. She absorbed the statement the way she absorbed facts, carefully, because it would be used. My phone lit again. An HR message, polite as always, asking if I needed support finalizing my transition paperwork. The system offered help with my own erasure. I didn't reply. Instead, I watched my work session collapse. Email logged out. Calendar wiped to blank. Chat list vanished. Deprovisioning wasn't violent. It was instant. A final notice came through before the last door closed. Badge access will be disabled. No exclamation point. No apology. Just a sentence turning a building into a border. Claire tucked the envelope deeper into her bag. "They'll frame you," she said. "As unstable. As retaliatory." "Let them," I said. They were going to write that story anyway. We stood in the cold garage air and listened to nothing happen. That was the strangest part. The world didn't flare. No siren. No shout. Just a process completing itself. I walked to the pedestrian door, swiped my badge, and got a red blink. Denied. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a beep and a dead sensor. The building no longer recognized me as someone who belonged. I turned and walked out through the vehicle ramp instead, the long way, past cameras and painted arrows, into the ordinary night. No escort, no speech, just distance growing between me and the glass towers. Behind me, the corporation kept its shape. Inside Claire's bag, Julian's name kept its. Locale justice didn't look like victory. It looked like a trail that couldn't be cleaned without someone noticing the scrubbing. In my rearview mirror, the garage lights stayed on. The same hum, the same indifference. Only my permissions had changed. In the first week after the badge went dead, I kept reaching for my phone the way you reach for a railing you don't need anymore. Nothing was wrong with the device. The problem was the absence of the small, constant confirmations I'd lived inside for years. The calendar pings, the access tokens refreshing, the quiet reassurance that the system still recognized my name as useful, that residual authority still lingered. Silence was not peace. It was a different kind of data, a frequency I hadn't learned to tune out yet. The first night I slept without an alarm set by someone else, I woke twice anyway. My jaw was sore from clenching in dreams I couldn't summarize. I stared at the ceiling and waited for the familiar vibration of an access prompt that never came. The absence made my skin itch. Then it faded, minute by minute, like latency resolving. I stopped going near the glass towers, not because anyone told me to, but because there was no reason to orbit a place that had already decided I was background noise. I took meetings in public spaces where no one cared about clearance levels. Cafes with chipped tables. A diner that smelled like oil and coffee no matter the hour. Forks clinking under tired HVAC. The world didn't end. That was the first lesson. A week after my exit, the company's site still loaded. Press releases kept their cadence. The stock ticker kept moving like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. An internal reorg memo leaked into the usual channels, the kind that sounds like weather, realignment, resource optimization, sunsetting non-core initiatives. The project that had carried Julian's name was referred to once, in a footnote, as concluded. Martin Kessler didn't disappear. His profile stayed polished. He attended a panel, smiling under stage lights, talking about trust frameworks and sustainable governance. I watched a clip with the sound low and still caught the applause rising at the right moments, as if approval had its own script. The system didn't have to punish me loudly. It punished me by continuing. I learned how quickly professional identity evaporates when your credentials stop validating. Recruiters stopped returning messages, and one email I sent sat marked sent with no reply until it might as well have been a draft. Old colleagues kept their distance, not out of cruelty, out of physics. Contact with me had become a risk they couldn't price. Nora Pike sent one message, short and clean. You made your choice. Stay quiet. It's survivable. I didn't answer, not because I hated her, but because her version of survival required me to accept the same premise the severance package did, that silence was an end state. Claire Benton's version of survival looked different. It arrived in the form of a link and a PDF. Her story went live on a Tuesday morning, early enough to catch commuters and late enough to avoid the first wave of legal responses. The headline didn't name what mattered. It couldn't. It used the safe nouns: outed gaps, process failures, unresolved incident. The body of it was worse and better than I expected. Worse because the redaction blocks were real. Entire paragraphs replaced by black bars or careful ellipses. Names removed, date softened, cause and effect turned into allegations and questions under review. The legal shell didn't just hide liability. It edited language itself. Better, because the piece existed at all. It created a public object the company couldn't erase without admitting the need to erase. It left a legal and corporate trail, the kind the system respected even when it pretended not to. It wasn't a clean win. It was a documented discomfort. Claire didn't call it justice. She called it a record. In a note underneath the link, she wrote that readers should focus on the pattern, not the missing names. Her restraint felt like competence, not cowardice. The incomplete copy sat in my apartment, not in a safe, not in a dramatic hiding place, just inside a plain folder with no logo. It was still incomplete. It still had gaps that would have made any courtroom laugh. That was the point. It wasn't proof the way people imagine proof. It was proof the way systems fear it, as a persistent contradiction. Sometimes, late at night, I opened the file and watched the timestamps. I didn't do it for pleasure. I did it the way you touch a bruise to confirm it's still there. The anomaly still existed. The access restrictions still made no sense unless someone had wanted them. Julian Rowe was no longer a blank field. I didn't know where the original lived. I didn't know what version history the company had cleaned. I didn't know how many hands had rewritten the narrative before it reached Martin's desk. Those questions stayed open, because the system had been built to keep them open. But my part of the story had stopped being about winning. It became about refusing to be absorbed. On a Friday afternoon, I sat in the same diner I'd been using as neutral ground and listened to the ordinary noise. Utensils, low voices, the old HVAC fighting the weather. My phone stayed quiet. No alerts. No calendar demands. No calls that didn't come. For the first time in years, that quiet didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a boundary. I thought about the last line in the severance package, the one that promised closure. It had been the cleanest lie of the whole document. Closure was a corporate product. Truth was not. Local justice was what you could do when the macro was owned by people like Martin. Keep the truth alive in a form that couldn't be deleted without someone noticing the deletion. I didn't feel heroic. I felt smaller than the machine and somehow less afraid of it. The system continued, because that's what systems do. The record continued, because I chose not to let it die. I wasn't the watcher anymore. I was the witness.